Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for Issues and Answers, Immigration. I'm Fred Martino. Border communities are seeing thousands of immigrants from Central America, many of them seeking asylum. Over the next hour, we'll explore the many issues related to the situation. First up, the urgent need for medical care. In-depth, Mallory Falk reports from a shelter in Las Cruces.
When 2-year-old Dylan arrived at the shelter, his nose was running and his forehead felt warm to the touch. So his father, Sergio, brought him into this medical van for a checkup. Dr. John Andazola is the volunteer doctor on duty. He checks to make sure Dylan's fever isn't high enough to warrant a trip to the hospital. Sergio and Dylan traveled here from Guatemala. They were detained by federal officials and spent a couple nights in a government holding facility. Sergio thinks that's where his son got sick. He says it was cold inside the facility and agents took away their blankets. He's grateful to be at this shelter now, where he's receiving better treatment. Dozens more patients will pass through the medical van before the night is over. And Andazola, who's been volunteering since 2014, says most children show up with routine colds or mild dehydration. If it weren't for the screenings, things could get dangerous fast.
We would miss the really sick kids. If we miss those kids, they're at risk of serious illness, death.
As of June 3rd, 6 migrant children have died in government custody. Some of those deaths came after immigration officials pledged to strengthen screenings for minors in custody. The latest government spending bill allots an additional $145 million to Customs and Border Protection to provide humanitarian assistance for migrants. That includes $128 million for hiring more medical professionals and $40 million for food, infant formula, and diapers. That's still a small portion of the agency's requested budget, which is more than $18 billion. And that funding doesn't follow migrants once they've been released from custody. Volunteer medics say many families still need medical assistance when they're dropped off at shelters and churches. Frida Adams is the former director of the Office of Border Health, part of the state health department. Now she coordinates volunteer doctors and nurses in southern New Mexico.
The most serious issues we've had is with small children, usually under 2 years old, because they're always the most vulnerable. They're always the most vulnerable to dehydration. They are usually breastfed, and the mothers have not had enough water to maintain their breast milk supply.
Adams says most children can be treated with over-the-counter medications, which volunteers often pay for out of pocket.
My goal is that we never send anybody to the emergency room unless they're absolutely in a bad situation, that we do not burden our already overcrowded emergency room. So what we're doing is actually preventing that from happening for the most part, even when we're in a shortage situation.
Still, Adams says she's learned not to dive straight into medical exams immediately after migrants have been dropped off. She says it's important to let families rest and have something to eat, to provide care beyond basic medicine.
We start handing out water, we start handing out snacks, because the thing they need the most is a place to sit their babies down. They've been carrying their babies for 2,000 miles, and even in the holding, many times they hold that child constantly. So to be able to set your child down and rest your arms is a big thing.
The federal government isn't paying for these humanitarian services, but the New Mexico Department of Health is chipping in gas and a driver for the medical van, about $1,000 a month. David Morgan with the department says the state has an obligation to treat everyone in New Mexico.
I certainly understand, how divided we are as a community, as a country about the subject of immigration. But at the end of the day, it's important to us to be able to not lose sight of the fact that these are people, who need help. And this is our role to be able to provide the safety net services to make sure that they are okay before they take off for the next leg of their journey.
Morgan says this medical van is one way the state can meet the growing need along this stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Mallory Falk.
Later in the program, more reporting from the field. We'll meet some New Mexico State University students who traveled to the Central American country of Guatemala. And we'll take you to an exhibit that explored the history of immigration in our region. But first, we welcome a panel of local experts: Nia Rucker of ACLU-New Mexico, Edith Tapia from the Hope Border Institute, and Molloy of New Mexico State University. We want to thank the League of Women Voters of Southern New Mexico for partnering with us on today's forum. We will hear audience questions from the League and others coming up. But first, I have a few questions, and I want to welcome all of our guests. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Nia, I want to begin with you. The American Civil Liberties Union, as many folks know who are watching this program, has been extremely active on the issues related to immigration, challenging the Trump administration in court on many fronts. Let's hear about the scope of the work.
Thank you. Yes, the ACLU National is very involved in many issues around the entire country involving, for example, the Muslim ban from about 2 years ago, and involving family separation. That was a year ago. That was the Miss L case. And more recently with prolonged detentions. That was the Damu versus Nielsen case. And the ACLU of New Mexico has been involved in some of that litigation, in finding plaintiffs at times when that's appropriate, and also supporting national ACLU's priorities with respect to immigration. Our local office is also interested in border militarization and in border checkpoints and the way that the Border Patrol treats people in this community. Because of that, we have been involved with some of the the migrant drop-offs that have been here in Las Cruces. We regularly go to the different migrant shelters and talk to people about their rights. Although we're interested in everybody's civil rights, and so when people are visiting from or are migrants here in the United States, we want everyone to know what their rights are and while they're here.
And I'm sure we'll get to a lot more detail on that from audience questions and as our forum continues. Edith, I know one policy that has been challenged is the Trump administration's so-called Remain in Mexico policy that would keep people in Mexico who are seeking asylum in the United States, a right that they have to be able to do that. Let's talk about that.
Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity, Fred. Yes, the Remain in Mexico program is also called the Migration Protection Protocols. That is officially its name, but we refuse to call it that because nowhere in that process is there protection for migrants or protocols. So essentially, in the beginning of the year, the government put forward this policy that would in fact force people, mostly Central American migrants, to wait for their asylum process while in Mexico. What we have seen so far is that several thousand migrants have been pretty randomly selected from the Northern Triangle to be placed into this program. And we've seen that also that includes pregnant women oftentimes, people who would be otherwise considered vulnerable populations. They end up in this process where after they are originally processed, then they're sent back to Mexico to wait for the first court. So at that point, they're supposed to show up to the middle of the bridge. They are processed. They're then transported into an immigration court and essentially have a hearing there. After that, they are returned and so on and so forth. So essentially, this puts a lot of migrants in dangerous conditions to be waiting for their asylum process with little access to counsel. Legal counsel. It's nearly impossible for attorneys to be able to reach clients there and just talk to them about their rights and what the process is like. It also puts them at risk. You know, they're oftentimes flagged as migrants already. And we've been seeing that as crime rates, and Molly can talk more about this, as crime rates in Juarez rise again, they are targeting, and they're very vulnerable for migrants in the community.
And as I just understand it, I mean, the city is overwhelmed.
Yes, it is. There's been a lot of response from local faith leaders as well and civil society in Ciudad Juarez that have been able to tend to some of the necessities for arriving migrants and return migrants. So if you think about the process of Remain in Mexico, which again, it's this cycle that just kind of keeps putting people back in harm's way rather than processing their right to seek asylum in a way that is able to secure them at least, some protection. What is happening in Ciudad Juarez is that the return migrants are in addition to the arriving migrants. So if you're already thinking about what we have called in terms of the metering system for asylum seekers, that is a result of the turn back policy that had been placed since last summer. Migrants who are coming here to seek asylum are having to write their name on a list. So right now the list has about 15 or something thousand people. 10,000 or so have been processed so far. So that means that there's about 5,000 or so migrants, only about less than 1,000 in shelters. So that leaves 4,000 migrants have been arriving who have either left, found another way of going, seeking asylum, or are waiting there. So that's already a population of 4,000 migrants. And then you add the return population, that's another 3,000 locally.
And you raise a really important point that this type of a policy is denying people access to attorneys in the U.S. who might be able to help them with their asylum cases. I want to ask you about this, Molly, this issue of asylum. I'm sure there will be very specific questions that come up during the audience portion. But I was really struck in watching a recent Las Cruces City Council meeting where citizens arrived to essentially criticize the city's response to this issue, that it seemed as if there was a lack of knowledge amongst many people about the fact that there is a right to seek asylum and that it is something that we have in this country available to people.
Well, there is definitely a right of asylum, a right to seek asylum, and it's a global right. The current law in the United States stems basically from issues that came up at the end of World War II, where there was a lot of concern about people who before the war had been turned away from safety in the United States and sent back to Europe, where many of them ended up being killed in concentration camps and just in the dangerous situation of the war. And so beginning in the early 1950s, asylum laws became part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is part of the US Federal Code. In addition to that, asylum is a right that is recognized internationally. In international law, it's a right that is recognized that people who are fleeing persecution in their home countries have the right to seek asylum in another country. In general language, the way we use the language in the United States, the word asylum has a lot of meanings that people attach to it that really has little to do with the actual legal meaning of the term. And that's perfectly understandable. In terms of the people who are coming now, I think it's good that we think of it in several different ways. First of all, asylum means a place that is safe. People are seeking a safe place for themselves and their family. Generally, they are seeking safety from persecution, from violence that may be political violence or criminal violence that is at extremely high levels in many of the Central American countries, as well as in Mexico. And yet, in some cases, they're seeking a safe place from hunger, literally hunger and poverty, extreme poverty in some of the Central American countries. Some of the things that they're fleeing from fit very neatly into our asylum laws, and other equally life-threatening situations are not a good fit with our asylum laws. And so for that reason, many people who do seek asylum under the laws of the United States end up not being successful because their particular situation isn't a good fit with the law in the way that it's written.
Which leads us to, I'm sure, a follow-up forum that we'll have down the line, which is the need for comprehensive immigration reform, which is urgently needed in the country.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to recognize the serious conditions that people are fleeing in our hemisphere and in other parts of the world, but especially just focusing on the Central American countries where most of the people coming now are from, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador mainly. These countries are really at the epicenter of climate change in our hemisphere. And these are countries where there have been multiple crop failures in the last 10 years, where the climate is changing to a degree where crops that have normally been grown very successfully, which provide both sustenance for many poor families and also labor for many, many people. These crops are no longer sustainable because of climate change and the effects of that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because indeed this may be a very long-term issue for us, not just a short-term one at the border. We are going to turn to audience questions in just a few minutes. But first, some American Indian students from New Mexico State University recently traveled to Guatemala. They learned about efforts to protect the land and water there. And as Michael Hernandez reports, the visit also prompted thoughts about immigration in the United States.
In the secluded jungle of north-central Guatemala, 10 indigenous students from New Mexico State University traveled to the country's Ixcan region. There, they spent a week living with Maya community members as part of the school's first environmental leadership exchange. Students toured the lush landscape as they learned about local efforts to protect a vital waterway, the Chicxoy River. Kayla Myers is Senior Program Specialist for Indian Resources Development at NMSU. Myers, an Eastern Shoshone descendant, says a proposed hydroelectric dam known as the Sha-La-La is threatening the Maya way of life. The Sha-La-La Dam has been a source of conflict since the 1970s. During the country's civil war, the Guatemalan government massacred thousands to build a similar dam. If the Chicxoy were dammed again, Myers says it would flood communities upriver and deprive other villages access to water and their only way of transportation.
They would lose access to any water for their crops, for bathing, for cooking, for all of that, as well as access to a very important part of their spiritual life, this river. And it's a beautiful river. That was an amazing part of the trip, was watching the students laughing and playing in the river with the community and seeing the real life of it. Because you read about it on paper, but being there and swimming in the river and traveling on it from community to community is such a joy and really magical.
On their visit, students met with elders and spiritual leaders from at-risk villages to learn about other challenges they face and share their own struggles. To communicate, Myers says students spoke in English, which was translated into Spanish, then into Maya Mom.
And so seeing them standing up and standing proud and being able to explain what is happening on Apache land and Dene land and across Native America was so inspiring for me. And seeing that translated across languages and across borders and realizing we're doing the same work and we have the exact same hopes.
So we talked about our struggles with land, water, and sacred site defense here in the States.
Antonio Garcia, a social work freshman, served as a translator. A descendant of Mexica and Jicarilla Apache people, Garcia says he took part in the trip to learn how to defend his relatives' sacred sites. He says living with his host family in Guatemala was a powerful experience.
I was with a young mother and her 2 sons, living with them, every night, spending the night there, and a different student would accompany me to that home. And translating and hearing the stories and eating meals with these families was just really powerful, hearing about their experiences and what life is like living in that community.
Students also visited the House of Memory, an interactive museum that takes visitors through the country's indigenous history. That's significant to Antoinette Benally, an agriculture senior from Farmington. Benally is a member of Navajo and Kiowa tribes. While she saw similarities between her own tribes and those she met, Benally says there's a disparity in how they pass down their traditions.
The elderly have stories to tell the younger generation, and it's nice that the younger generation listens to the elders and their language, and they carry on the traditions that the elders taught them. And back home, our elders, we can't really communicate with them because we don't know our own native language, and I don't know my own native language, and I don't know the culture, and it's really hard communicating with my grandparent, or my grandma, I guess.
But Benali says she is starting to learn Navajo with help from Rosetta Stone. On their journey to find common ground overseas, Myers says she hopes students find value in getting to know people from a country at the center of the border crisis.
This is a very critical moment in our history, especially here in the borderlands and especially here in our community where we have thousands of migrants who are passing through. And it is so important for young people to have this kind of exchange so that they can put stories to faces and learn the history and the actual lived context of the people who are coming here.
As those thousands of Guatemalan and other Central American migrants seek asylum in the U.S., Garcia says it's important to remember the person, not the terms used to describe them.
We hear illegal, we hear undocumented, we label these people when really what they are is human beings. And really what they are is indigenous people. And how can anybody be illegal on stolen land? This land belongs to indigenous people, so our migration patterns have long past existed before these borders. And understanding personal struggles, understanding these people, as human beings, it humanizes them in a sense to where we can relate to them.
For KRWG Public Media, I'm Michael Hernandez.
An important message there as we continue our discussion on immigration, and I'm very pleased to welcome our first audience member with a question for our panel of experts.
Hi, my name is Eileen Van Wee, and I'm from Las Cruces. Molly has mentioned a few of the reasons why, root causes for why people are fleeing their countries, and the USAID provided some funding for some programs that were relatively successful, and I think that funding has gone away. So the question is in two parts here. What do you see as solutions to what's going on in the Northern Triangle of Central America that would help potential migrants stay in their own countries? And how can the U.S. government, businesses, organizations, and individuals help provide education, employment, and violence reduction in these countries?
Molly, why don't we have you start with that?
Sure. I have read about some of those programs, mainly funded through the United States State Department through USAID. And sadly, some of those programs that were started, that have actually been in existence for many years, have now been cut by the current administration. And it does seem really ironic that our government, which is so adamant about keeping people from other countries out of the United States at all costs, including at the cost of many people's lives, that they would take away the funding that could help agriculture be more successful, that could help law enforcement in these countries be more successful in terms of combating gang violence and drug violence, in terms of education programs that could help young people find a better way of making a dignified living in these countries. When programs like that are cut, often people in the communities and the large cities in the region find that they have no choice but to migrate in order to, just for basic survival. And so programs like this can be very, very important in providing alternatives to migration. And I don't believe they should be cut. I think some of the monies that we're paying for, our tax dollars are being used for long-term detention, for programs that are very restrictive on the human rights of these people, would be much better spent in making life better for them in Central America.
Edith, I know that the Hope Border Institute does an annual report and talks about issues related to immigration. It was very encouraging to me to see the students from New Mexico State University getting a chance to go to Guatemala to see the conditions there and help better inform them about how we do have many people who are coming into the United States due to violence, extreme poverty, other issues. Give me a sense, in your opinion on this, the need for this type of information, that people need to understand that when you have thousands of people traveling thousands of miles at great risk, great difficulty, that there are real reasons for this to be happening.
Yes, well, I think it's incredibly important to be able to see it firsthand, right? And I think in doing so, not only do you put a human face to the stories and the numbers that you hear and that you read on the news, but you also get a real sense as to what the issues are. A lot of them, as you said, root causes. I think Molly put it perfectly, right? You need to be investing a lot of times in the infrastructure in terms of like the legal system and corruption, so people feel free to denounce crime for agriculture, all these purposes. But seeing it, what people I think realize once you go and have that opportunity is that a lot of the struggles are struggles that we could relate to, right? There were things that could force you to migrate if you were in that situation as well. So I think it's incredibly powerful, and nothing can do that better than seeing it firsthand and understanding it down the road.
Yeah.
Because
and
if you were facing those conditions, what will you do as well?
Certainly, and of course, not all of us have the opportunity to actually go to another country, but it's been heartening to many of us to see people in our region volunteer who do have the opportunity to hear testimony from people who have made it to this country about why they are here, about the better life that they are seeking. I know that that's something that we try to do in our programming, is to give people that opportunity to hear firsthand about these stories, and it's so important to hear that. We have another audience question, but very quickly I will just say, I mean, these stories didn't just start now. When I first arrived in this region about a decade ago, one of the most unforgettable stories that I have ever had in 30 years of journalism was sitting down with a young man who at the time was a New Mexico State University student. And he told me that at age 14 in El Salvador, he told his parents, "You must save me. You must take me to the United States." They had other family members who had come here, and his family did that for him, and he came to the U.S. and built a new life here. Our next audience question comes from someone with a shirt on that says, "Refugees are welcome."
Hi, my name is Jan Thompson, and I am from the Las Cruces area. Most of what you've been talking about deal with the asylum seekers who come through Las Cruces and then move on into the interior of the country. But my concern is that we have 55,000 people who are being held in detention, long-term often. And recently, just last week, a whistleblower with the Department of Homeland Security released data that showed the overuse of solitary confinement for people in detention. And I'd like to know what you can tell us about that. And also, Ms. Tapia, you told us about the treatment of pregnant women who are just making their way through. I would like to know about the treatment of pregnant women who are in detention. So it's open to any and all of you.
Okay, let me start with you on this, Nia, because you said that the ACLU actually is making visits to detention centers and is monitoring this situation in addition to taking action in court.
Yes, that is correct. So I'd say about the past year, we had been hearing about the conditions that gay men and transgender women were being held in immigration detention. So that included solitary confinement, among other abuses. I mean, just absolutely horrible homophobic, transphobic abuse that is completely uncalled for in any situation, and particularly when you have a very vulnerable population. So we have done some advocacy work and some lawsuits on behalf of those individuals, as well as pregnant people in custody who are also being held in either in solitary or in other forms of detention that not receiving medical care. So most of those lawsuits have been either class action or other forms of advocacy on behalf of them.
Okay. Thank you, Nia. I want to give Edith a chance to weigh in on this as well.
Oh, thank you, and thank you, Jan, for the question. At Hope Border Institute, we've also been reporting and documenting a lot on prolonged detention. So that's an area that we focus and that we continue to monitor and have been observing through our visits, but also in our court observations, that people are being held longer and longer for a variety of reasons. And a particular concern is also the treatment or the detention of pregnant women. I had mentioned that in the Remain in Mexico program, we had seen pregnant women in the program, but that is also the fact, or that's also what's happening in detention. And unfortunately, what has happened is that the policy was changed from the end of 2017 into 2018, where now ICE no longer has it in their policy to release pregnant women. So now they are being detained while pregnant. And what we have seen, unfortunately, are miscarriages, people who have had miscarriage and then deported, and people just having a lot of difficult times going through their pregnancy, obviously in detention. They don't have the right medical attention there. There shouldn't be a reason why someone is detained while pregnant and having to be in those conditions. I don't think anyone should be held in detention, period, but most definitely not pregnant women. So it's obviously a very huge concern and something that can be changed.
Okay. We have another question from our audience.
Resident of the Las Cruces area. My question is rather a technical one, a legal one. What are the grounds for refusing to let what is clearly a refugee enter the country? What are the grounds for denying them the opportunity to apply for asylum? And what are the grounds for denying asylum?
Okay, very important issues. And Molly, you addressed this earlier, that in fact, while many people are seeking desperate, they're fleeing desperate conditions in their home countries, it may not meet the legal requirements for asylum. However, there also is great disparity depending on what court you end up with, and unfortunately, for many folks in our region who end up in the court assigned to the El Paso area, almost all of the asylum cases are rejected, whereas you may have other areas, other courts, where a good number of them are accepted.
That's all true. The grounds for asylum in the Immigration and Nationality Act, the person must have suffered persecution in their home country, or they can establish a credible fear of future persecution should they be forced to return to their country. But in addition to having been persecuted, they have to establish that the persecution is on the grounds of several specific things: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. I think I have all 5 of those correct. And sometimes a case might be really cut and dried. For instance, a person may be able to establish that they're a member of an ethnic group, that it is well known that this ethnic group is persecuted in their home country. For instance, the Muslim Uyghur population in China. It's very well established in the news media and by human rights groups that these people are persecuted in China by the national government. But many of the people who come to our region, especially from Mexico and Central America seeking asylum, they really find it difficult to seek asylum based on one of the protected grounds. Generally, religion is not an issue. Race may be an issue in some countries. Indigenous people in Guatemala may be able to prove that they've been persecuted or would be persecuted because of their ethnicity. Political opinion can come into play in many of these countries. For instance, for a human rights activist or an environmental activist in Guatemala or Honduras may be able to prove that they're a member of an association or a group or a political party that opposes the national government's development of mega projects like the dam that was shown in the video that endangered the livelihood and of the indigenous people. Many people who seek asylum here are seeking it based on their membership in a particular social group that may be persecuted. For instance, transgender people or people who are gay or lesbian, any member, part of the LGBTQ community. Many of those folks are terribly persecuted in these countries. Social group may be a profession, such as journalists or human rights activists. And these people will have to document their activism or their professional work in a particular social group in order to qualify for asylum. And you know, I don't mean to make light of it, but I think of the scene in A Wizard of Oz where Dorothy, at the end of the wizard giving out benefits, she says, "I don't think there's anything in the bag for me." And sadly, for people who are fleeing extreme poverty and extreme criminal violence in some of the countries of Central America, the asylum law as it stands now doesn't really apply to their situation. And so it makes it very difficult for people to prove their cases. Another aspect, going back to the detention issue, when people are detained for these very long periods of time, it makes it very difficult for them to document their case, even when they do have the opportunity to go to court, even when they have a lawyer helping them and representing them. Getting documents from their families or from their churches or from other groups in the region that may be able to document what happened to them can be very difficult when a person is held in a prison. And I think it's really important to use the word prison to describe detention centers in our region. I think I've been to all of them, to Sierra Blanca, to the El Paso Detention Center, to the Otero County Detention Center. All of them are run by corporations that also run private prisons. In fact, there are criminal prisoners locked up in the very same facilities with the immigration detainees. And so to try to make ourselves feel better that these folks are not treated like criminals, I think is a real problem, because in these facilities, they are.
Okay. We have another question.
My name is Liz Rodriguez Johnson, and I'm a resident of Doña Ana County. I've been volunteering since when the asylum seekers first arrived. When I know that at that time there were several churches that were open. I was at the Gospel Rescue Mission. You know, we were going out buying medical supplies because the people were arriving, and then as the situation evolved, it became more structured, I think. At Las Cruces High, there was a lot of food, there was a lot more volunteers, there was firefighters everywhere, to now at the Brown Center, the old armory at the Brown Center. My question is, you know, are we getting more organized with time? Is there going to be a structure in place, permanent structure in place in Las Cruces? Because I was also at a city council meeting, I'm not sure if it was the same one Mr. Martino was at, but where the mayor made it very clear that it was not, helping is not an option. You know, they're gonna come to Las Cruces, they can either live on the streets or we can help them. But it's their legal right to be here. So my question is there going to be a permanent assistance facility for the asylum seekers?
Yeah, and of course we know that New Mexico's congressional delegation is asking for federal help for Las Cruces and other communities that have been using local funds to help those who are seeking asylum in the United States. Edith, I want to ask this question to you. We do certainly appear to have a situation that is going to continue, possibly for the long term. Do you think that this is something that we do need to have better coordination with the federal government to ensure that there is funding available to help folks who are seeking asylum in the U.S.? We saw in our first report that the total budget request for all activities of Border Patrol, and that's only Border Patrol, that doesn't include other agencies, was $18 billion. So there is money there. It's just not being spent necessarily on humanitarian, most of the money anyway, is not being spent on humanitarian help.
Yes, I think that's a great question, actually. And I do think that, also just leading back to the audience question, that are we going to continue to help as a community and step up? And I think that the answer should be yes, and we do need to be more organized, we do need to be more structured. I think that both El Paso and Las Cruces have shown a great amount of collaboration with each other, and in the community that I have heard from outsiders who have come to visit, they're surprised at how well the community has stepped up. And in the case of Las Cruces, you know, the city stepping up and giving so much money for this, right? So I think that yes, it is something that is needed. And in terms of coordination with the federal government, I'm worried to say that, I mean, obviously there should be open communication between the agencies, and I think that at some point historically we had, like El Paso with Ruben Garcia, you know, has had a good relationship in terms of knowing how many people are being released and having it done in a more orderly way. However, and what we have seen as well, that in terms of people who are spending the money and who are like upfronting the cost for hospitality have been the community and have been different organizations, faith organizations in our communities, schools, basically civil society. And I think that that's great. But of course, you know, that should be also backed up because we have stepped up in place of the government. And I think that in terms of the funding that is allocated for this agency is one of the largest, has one of the largest budgets. And so when they talk about getting more money, they have gotten more money. They have gotten a lot more money over the last decade or so, if not more. Yet they have shown very little to be accountable and to be transparent on how they're using it, right? In terms of the facilities that they have now, they've known for a while that the people, that the demographics of migrants that were coming were shifting. So the fact that they have done nothing in 10 years, 12 years of their budget tripling or, you know, increasing more than that, and they have done very little, I think to me leaves me with very little hope that they're going to continue to do so unless we continue to pressure them to be more transparent. If they want, like, they shouldn't have more money. They have plenty of money. They could be allocating it smart, like in a smarter way or more efficiently, and also just by not detaining people the way that they continue to do.
Okay, I have another question.
You bet. I'm Kathy Nicodemus, and thank you for being here. My concern is after people leave here. After they go to their sponsor and, okay, you're given a court date, it's 5 years down the line. You have to get a pro bono lawyer, all these things. There aren't enough ICE agents to keep track of what's going on, well trained. I want them to be people who do things safely. Then the other thing is, what can we do in these countries that these people, again, are having to leave? Where do you see something that we as the audience listening can maybe make a change? Because there's hopefully there'll be a lot of us. Yeah. What can we do?
So there's really two questions there. Nia, let me begin with you for the first one, and that is assistance for folks who find out, you know, that their court date is far into the future, and how do they gather the evidence that is needed? How do they provide for themselves, their families, in the meantime, waiting for that court date? These are really very important issues for thousands of people who are coming into the country.
Definitely. And one frustration that I know I have is that there's no public defender system in immigration. In fact, there's no right to an attorney in civil cases and in administrative cases, which is where immigration law lands. And so when I'm talking to people, you know, migrants that are coming through or people who are soon to be released from detention, I, you know, make sure to tell them, like, talk to a reputable immigration lawyer. I'm happy to refer people, but also, unfortunately, most of them do charge quite a bit. So Catholic Charities also does a lot of immigration work, and they have a national system. And basically, what we need is like a federal defender system for immigration, and to be able to represent people, to help, you know, so that they can present their best case. People with immigration lawyers tend to have much more successful outcomes when it comes to their cases than people who represent themselves. It does happen on occasion that people represent themselves and are successful, but generally speaking, they need a strong advocate on their side. Okay. And that's my recommendation.
Okay, and Molly, I know you addressed this to some degree earlier in the show, but things that the U.S. could do to help many of the Central American countries to improve conditions there, to possibly reduce the influx of folks coming to the U.S. seeking asylum.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that we could do as Americans, as U.S. voters and taxpayers, is we could demand political change in terms of the attitudes in our federal government towards people who are seeking asylum, towards people who, for one reason or another, from many different parts of the world, not just Central America, find it necessary to migrate. And I think because of economic conditions in different places, because of the effects of climate change on subsistence farming and on other kinds of economic livelihoods that people are accustomed to in different parts of the world, we need to really demand of our government a real reform of our immigration system to account for some of the things that I believe will continue to happen as time goes along. As many of you probably know, there's a program called Temporary Protected Status that's been in existence for many, many years, at least the 30 years that I've been involved with different aspects of immigration policy. And this allows, when there is a natural disaster or some other, maybe a civil war in another place in the world, it allows people to stay in the United States temporarily and not have to go through the individual asylum process or some other way to immigrate to the United States legally. And there are currently hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, living in the United States under various temporary statuses in regard to the countries of the world where they came from. I think that in our current political climate, the Trump administration is actually trying to take away this status from various groups of people, from Haiti, from El Salvador, from other countries in Central America, status that they've actually had for a very long time.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is be informed, vote, and speak out.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you're informed, in addition to voting, speak out. Let your elected representatives know what your position is on these issues.
Yeah,
because we often complain, but very few of us actually, in terms of the larger picture, take the time to write a letter or call.
Right. I mean, the calls for comprehensive immigration reform, both to make it less possible to immigrate to the United States and to make it more possible for the people who really need to immigrate to come to the United States. The calls for this kind of reform have been around for at least 20 years.
Yes,
and have never gotten anywhere.
Right. Well, and we should say, a number of years ago, we did have a comprehensive immigration reform plan pass in the U.S. Senate. It was never brought up for a vote in the House, which I'm amazed when I talk to people about this, that very often folks don't realize that. They don't know that, in fact, there was a plan. We just have a few minutes left. I have time for one more question.
This is sort of, my name's Karen Dumont, and I live in Las Cruces. It's a sort of educational question. How did it happen that immigration became constricted or illegal? Where and to what extent does it reflect our public policy?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. Let me start with you on this, Edith. You know, we're talking about this issue in a country that has been strengthened and built for its entire history on immigrants and continues to be built through the diversity, through the incredible contributions that immigrants make. And it's something we should never lose when we have discussions about immigration.
No, absolutely. But I think, first of all, I want to say that I don't think migration is illegal, right? people have the right, especially internationally, to migrate. And we should have a right to migrate and also a right not to migrate, have to migrate and leave our places, our home countries. I think that the idea of criminalizing migration has been in the works for at least 30 years, if not before, and it has been done little by little, right? I think sometimes, many times with actions that would go unnoticed. But the immigration laws in general in this country have been restrictive from the beginning with the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And so from the very beginning, that has already had the notion of trying to keep certain people out and in to the convenience of, I would say, to the convenience of the government,
yeah.
Right? So that has been increasingly more punitive and also more restrictive, I think, in the last 3 decades. But the fact of just having a misdemeanor, which is what a lot of people get when they cross, what they say cross without inspection in between ports of entry, that is a misdemeanor that essentially lands them in jail. That is the same as, just maybe getting a ticket or something like that, that would put you in jail for X amount of time, and then that already limits your possibilities for migration, right? It kind of goes into your record, so it makes it more difficult. So that has been exacerbated over the last, definitely with this administration, but it has been in the works for quite some time.
Okay. We didn't know that this question was going to come up at the end of our audience portion, but it is a very good transition to our next segment. We leave you today with some thoughts on immigration from an exhibit at the University of Texas at El Paso. While the exhibit is over, its message continues to resonate.
The name of the exhibit is Where the World Met the Border. And this is the story of the Ellis Island of the US-Mexico border, but it's been a place of migration centuries before. So it shows you 10 different sites that this museum will cover. And each one of these sites, each one of these buildings will tell a different chapter about this uniquely global place, apparently in the middle of nowhere, but that for a long, long time has actually been right in the middle of things. Just like today we hear with the debates about migration. Well, this place, those debates have been going on for a long, long time. They keep repeating themselves.
The inspiration was the fact that this is actually an endangered community right now. A large portion of the First Ward has already been destroyed. It was destroyed to make room for the convention center in the 1970s. And now there's another considerably large portion that is under threat of demolition because of the arena that the city would like to build.
So the First Ward is El Paso's oldest neighborhood. This is literally where El Paso was born. When the city first had its charter in 1873, the boundaries were set, and on the north, San Francisco Street, on the east, El Paso Street, and then the rest was bordered by the borders were set by the Rio Grande itself.
There's a map over there of early El Paso, the first platted map. All the east-west streets are St. Louis, San Francisco, right? They're the roads that are going to those areas. North-south are Chihuahua, Durango, Santa Fe, right? So we're a crossroads. People have always been coming here, passing through here, trade, commerce, just economic opportunity, and still today. That's why people are here today.
You can see 3 acequias that were constructed by Ponce de Leon, Maria Ponce de Leon, back in 1827, when it was the foundational settlement where El Paso was born, called the Ponce de Leon Ranch.
People are coming from all over, and they're following trails out here in the 1820s, right? And so they're coming out here and settling, and a lot of times they're men, right? And they're marrying local fronteriza women who grew up in here. The town of El Paso del Norte, on the other side of the river, now Ciudad Juarez, it was a bustling community, and so people were coming in from other places in the United States and mixing into this culture. Then you have people coming from overseas, so people from Italy, from Syria. One of the most notable ones is the Chinese community. So they come to build the railroad. So the first railroad gets here in 1881. It comes from the west and makes it to El Paso, and you have the largest Chinese community in Texas because of that.
There's a very intriguing cartoon from 1904 where people were calling for a wall to keep out illegal immigrants. But the illegal immigrants were not Mexicans, they were Chinese. The first calls for a border fence here in El Paso was in 1904. So already they were calling to build a wall. History repeats itself over and over again.
And so this neighborhood in 1900 is just booming. In 1906, we have the depot that's still there, the Union Depot, that was built by Daniel Burnham. It's still extant. And because of that depot, you have an influx of people coming in by train, and they're all coming through this neighborhood.
Duranguito in the First Ward played a huge role in helping to spark the largest social revolution of the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution. And one of the most famous inhabitants of Duranguito residents was Pancho Villa. Here you see him with his wife. So there is a home, an adobe home on Leon Street in Duranguito that right now is in danger of demolition in case this arena gets built by the city. Which would be a travesty, because we believe that that should be perhaps a museum to the importance of the history of the Mexican Revolution for the city. It completely altered the demographics of El Paso and the border.
I mean, this is the amazing thing about immigrants coming in, is they are assimilating like immigrants do to the local culture, but that culture is neither American or Mexican. It's this fronteriza culture, right? And so even today, I think you could say that some of that's left over, that El Paso and Juarez are a bit different than the rest of the country because people are having to adapt to this hybrid culture. I think looking at El Paso's history, looking at how we've managed to coexist and grow as a community here, this is what the rest of the nation should be focusing on.
That video essay from Michael Hernandez, a reminder of the larger context of immigration and its vital role in the strength and diversity of our nation. That's Issues and Answers for everyone at KRWG News. I'm Fred Martino. Thanks for joining us.